It's wonderful to be here with you today. I think maybe I came the farthest. And I want to thank Den Gamle Bø, did I say that sort of correctly, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I spent most of the last decade working for Boston City Historical Society in Massachusetts in the US, but I left their staff last year to do a Fulbright Fellowship in Helsinki, Finland, researching European city museums. And since I finished the Fulbright and returned to the US, I've continued to spend most of my time investigating and writing about city museums cross-culturally. In fact, this semester I have a fellowship at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm more or less creating my version of a manifesto for city museums. And you may not have realized it when you signed up for this conference, but you're going to be laboratory mice because I want to try out parts of this manifesto work in progress that I'm creating on you today and see what you think. And so I want to make it clear you don't have to agree with all of my ideas, but I would love to have an interesting conversation about them with you. So over the past 3 years, I've looked at museums that interpret the city in 16 different countries throughout Europe and North America to study what these institutions are doing well and what they are doing poorly. And while there's still a lot out there to investigate, the list looks a little big, but it's actually quite small still. At this point, I do think I'm creating an overall snapshot of the state of the field in my head. Today, I'm going to talk about 8 trends and issues that I see affecting city museums over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to mix in some of the projects I've observed at the more innovative city museums, projects I think are really exciting. And then I'm also going to suggest some ideas that I haven't seen yet, but that I wish some city museums would try. And a couple of my themes have already been raised so far this morning. That's great, so hopefully I can build on them as we go along. Before launching in, I want to talk a minute about audience. For city museums, a fundamental audience issue is understanding the difference between the needs of residents and the needs of tourists. This map of Copenhagen is the work of computer programmer Erik Fischer, and it shows this concept beautifully. Has anyone seen Erik Fischer's maps before? Raise your hand. Okay, a few of you, good. So Fischer took the data from Flickr, the photo sharing website, and mapped where people take photographs. And he did this for a number of cities throughout the world, although unfortunately he hasn't created one for Aarhus. So we can see his maps as a record of the places tourists care about in red versus the places residents care about in blue. How does this translate to the city museum? In general, tourists come to the city museum for a quick overview, the famous stories, the things that happen in the city center, and they usually visit only once, maybe twice in a lifetime. Residents, by contrast, want to dig deep into their personal connections with the city. They care about neighborhoods and the recent history they themselves remember, and they will keep coming back to the city museum again and again for repeat visits if there is something new there that interests them. City museums often fall into the trap of thinking they can serve both of these audiences with the same content. Sometimes there is overlap, but much of the time there is not. I believe that city museums have a very important public service to provide for their cities by addressing the needs of city residents first and foremost. All of the issues and ideas I'm going to discuss today flow from this belief that residents are the most important audience. If Erik Fischer did a map of Aarhus, I suspect that Den Gamle Bø would be one of the red parts, one of the tourist parts. So staff members may now find themselves having to take extra care when toggling back and forth between the audience for Den Gamle Bø and the audience for the City Museum. With the local audience in mind, the first issue I want to raise is that the 21st century City Museum needs to spend a lot more effort grappling with the contemporary city, not just the city's past. Jack Lohman, the director of the Museum of London, has written about this problem where the very act of collecting and preserving the city, of rounding everything up and putting it inside the museum in glass cases, takes all the complexity and life and chance we find on city streets and effectively kills it, renders it static and lifeless. Another way to put this is that we've been treating city museums like natural history museums that curate dead things, specimens, and taxidermy, when we really need to be treating them as zoos or botanical gardens. We are curating something that is still living and breathing. Blending the present, and for that matter, the future, with the past is one way of returning some of that life to the museum. Moreover, I would argue that if our main audience is the city's residents, we can't ignore the city they care about, the one they inhabit every day, the city of the present, with all of its messy problems, its everyday serendipities, its hopes and dreams. There are a few ways I've seen museums bring in the contemporary. One is to use the City Museum as a forum to discuss contemporary urban issues. I'm showing you here on the slide a recent exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York about a new local government initiative to bring fresh produce to the city's poorest neighborhoods. The Museum of the City of New York also regularly hosts panel discussions on issues confronting present-day New Yorkers, the city's new taxi plan, for example. Later today, we'll hear about another approach from Museum Rotterdam, which has added to its staff an urban curator who works with current Rotterdam residents to co-create programs and exhibitions. Several other European museums are experimenting with this method, including the City Museum in Frankfurt, and I'm sure Copenhagen Museum will have something to say about contemporary engagement this afternoon as well. But a city museum you may not be as familiar with that's working really hard on its contemporary direction is the Museum of Vancouver in Canada. It has not only a curator of contemporary issues, but also a curator of engagement and dialogue. And in addition to the exhibitions and programs on contemporary issues, it offers this really interesting blog that deals with current events and things going on in the city that residents should know about. Sometimes because it's related to the city's history, and sometimes just because it's good information. Also, their branding, graphic design, and text is contemporary and fresh, not traditional. That may be less of an issue for some of the European city museums, but I know in the States we have a big problem where city museums, history museums in general, feel like they have to stay in the past with their design as well as with their subject matter. So at any rate, for Museum of Vancouver, instead of starting with the past and working up through time, our typical historical chronology, Museum of Vancouver starts with the present, what current residents care about and are talking about, and works backwards from there. I think this is an important shift for city museums that we all need to consider. The second issue I want to raise is related to the first. So I talked about the process of taking all the life out of the city by boxing it up in the museum. We've all been watching this Bilbao effect, where cities build big new signature museums to increase tourism and bolster the local economy. Some of these projects have succeeded and some have not. And while such projects can make some sense for art museums, I think it's very risky for city museums because it doesn't solve the problem of bringing the vibrancy of the streets into the museum. It just gives you a bigger box in which to render those streets static and lifeless. And then you also have to spend a lot of energy and money taking care of that big box. And I should stop here and say that from my dinner conversation last night, I know that not everyone agrees with me on that point, so maybe we can actually have a good discussion about it at some point later today. But in my opinion, the fact that the Aarhus City Museum building is being sold may not be a bad thing. Yes, it would be nice to have a modest-sized building with flexible space for programming and changing exhibitions, but city museums have so much catch-up work to do to build meaningful connections with their local audience. I think they need to spend their efforts and resources getting out into the streets, developing projects in neighborhoods. And in fact, I don't even think city museums should be spending resources creating these core permanent exhibitions that tell the chronological story of the city from its founding to the present day. There was a time when city museums needed to mount such exhibitions because there were few other ways to get that information. But now there are so many options for learning about city history. And I've been to so many city museums where visitors are struggling to get through those core permanent exhibitions. They seem to be the least engaging parts of the museum. So our city museums, I think, need to provide imaginative experiences that stimulate curiosity and make residents want to be urban explorers. I think if we can do that, if we can plant that seed, then we'll go a long way. City museums need to change their programming regularly, just as the streets change, and they need to bring their programming out into the city streets where life is being lived to meet residents where they are at. Maybe when we've mastered that concept and built a really strong local constituency that cares about the work we do, then we can build big buildings. And if I talk about getting out on the streets, into the neighborhoods, what exactly do I mean? After all, city museums have been talking about this for years, walking tours, museums without walls. But until recently, they didn't have very many tools for doing it effectively. I think that's changing, and it will continue to change even more in the coming years. And one way it's changing is through geotagging. So in the past few years, there's been an explosion of mapping projects. We saw some already this morning. Suddenly, everything is Google mappable. And are you familiar with the term geotagging? Raise your hand. Okay, good. I don't need to explain it. So geotagging affects city museums significantly because our work is so place-based. In the 20th century, the process of collecting and preserving city history meant rounding up all of those stories and objects from all over the city and consolidating them under one roof in the museum. But this process often severed the relationship between the historical material and the places where it was created or had meaning. Now, however, we can send our history back out into the city itself virtually so that we can create these moments on every corner of standing in the spot where history happened. So Martin already showed you street museum mobile apps for London and Aarhus. So those are great, I love them. This idea of taking your mobile phone and walking around the city to pull up images from another era and compare then and now. We've also seen 2 non-museum projects in the last year or so that geotag historic photographs on a global scale, so not just for one city, but really anywhere that Google goes, also with apps for mobile devices. So History Pin is one. It's a British project. And its competitor is What Was There. And right now it's sort of this race to see who can load the most photographs and which one is going to be the standard. So these 2 projects allow anyone anywhere in the world to upload historic photographs and pin them to the Google map. So it doesn't have to be an archive or a museum. It can really just be anybody at their home computer. And then using Google Street View, you can line up the historic photo with the contemporary street and toggle back and forth between then and now. So these sites are user-friendly, they're free to use, and you can go out then with your phone and walk around on the streets and see all these images that are essentially crowdsourced. You no longer need funding for your own custom mobile app. So I did an experiment this summer when I was in New York. I loaded some objects from the collections of the New York Historical Society and the Metropolitan Museum of Art into what was there in History Pin to see what would happen. And I found that you can get some really rich new connections when you understand that certain objects lived across the street or down the block from each other. And when you add the photographs and even earlier prints in with the objects, it gets even richer. So I'm hoping objects will be the next wave of this geotagging trend, and it will be an exciting new way we can bring some of our content, more of our content, out on the streets. And then maybe after we do the objects, what comes next? I think we need to keep on thinking about that. And not only do we have these digital tools for sending images and objects and information out on the streets, but we also have this interesting new trend of pop-up experiences. You all know what I mean by pop-up? Raise your hand. Okay. Oh, okay, good. So there are all sorts of pop-up things these days, pop-up stores, pop-up restaurants, but there are also pop-up history projects. And I think this is a really exciting way to think about urban history for city residents because it aligns directly with their experience of the city. Residents so often explore the city on foot and through the course of their daily lives observe all sorts of things changing around them. When a new shop opens in their neighborhood or someone paints the front steps, they notice it. So why not make urban history part of what pops up in front of them in their daily path, and then have it go away again, only to be replaced later by something else. I really like this idea also because it can be low budget and experimental. If it's only designed to last for a few weeks or a few months, it doesn't have to be made from expensive materials and take years of planning like our permanent exhibitions in the museum space. So here I'm showing you an example from Hamburg, the Fußnote project. It works like a historical marker program documenting the Holocaust era in Hamburg, except instead of the usual permanent plaque made in bronze or something like that, the marker is spray painted on the ground and eventually it will wear away. Pop-up history could also look like this. Or like this. This is from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's called If This House Could Talk. For a week in October, the local historical society works with residents to post historical information about their houses on signs in every front yard. It's informal and it's pop-up, and it's also created through community participation. Which leads me to my next trend, personal history. There's an interesting American study chronicled in a book called The Presence of the Past that I think about all the time in my work. This detailed phone survey of 1,500 Americans found that people have a lot of trouble connecting to the big picture history that they learn in school. It just doesn't have much meaning or resonance for them. But they'll spend hours and hours connecting with history that is personal, family history, house history, like the Cambridge project I showed you. I think technology is allowing us to connect to the personal on a whole new level, but we still haven't tapped its full potential. So I envision a day when I can walk into the City Museum and say, my name is Rainey Tisdale and I live on Amherst Street, and here are 10 other data points about me. And a screen or a mobile device will say, welcome. Here's a list of all the Tisdales who have ever lived in Boston and what we know about them. Here's a list of all the people who have ever lived on Amherst Street and what we know about them. And by the way, on the second floor gallery, there's an object on display that you might be really interested in based on what you told us about your hobbies. And oh, you live in a triple-decker. We also have an exhibition about Boston's vernacular housing, and you can go look at triple-deckers there and learn about them. And so this becomes another hook to draw people into urban history. And I think a lot of the information is already there, it just needs to be linked differently. So what if our job as curators was to make those links, make those connections? And I should stop and say that I want to be clear that I do agree with Soren that we can't only do personal history. We do need to recognize our collective history and tend that and curate it. But I just think that personal history is this powerful hook, and we are only really just tapping the surface there in terms of its potential to bring people into the larger work that we're doing. And what goes hand in hand with personal history is hyper-local history. We've spent the last 15 years pushing out around the globe with all of these networks and with the internet. And while all of that global reach will continue to be very important, I think we're also seeing people voice a need to still be rooted in a very local context, to be connected to their local news and their local places. So it's this bifurcated relationship. On one hand, very global, on the other hand, hyper-local. So how can we better interpret and also document these local places to make these connections stronger for city residents? Do we need to stop thinking about the city on the scale of neighborhoods and start thinking about it on the scale of blocks? And particularly residential blocks, not just the city center. I'm working with a group of graduate students from Brown University this semester on a public history project in Providence, the city where Brown is located. And one of our ideas is to choose a neighborhood block somewhere in the city and document it deeply and comprehensively. Research everyone who has ever lived on that block, document its smells and its sounds, observe the regulars who walk down it every day and note their habits. So might this be an approach that would have some resonance for all of those blue spots on Eric Fisher's maps that I showed you earlier? Could we also take better advantage of residents' windows on the street, filling them with interesting bits of local history? Could we recruit street or block captains to organize hyperlocal projects with their neighbors? Could we organize a different kind of walking tour that gives residents a chance to meet each other and learn together about the hidden stories of their hyper-local context? Another trend that affects city museums is the shift to an increasingly interdisciplinary world. It makes perfect sense for city museums to be interdisciplinary because cities are such complex organisms, and to understand them, we need to study them from many different angles. The most obvious place to start in terms of interdisciplinary work is to invite collaborations with contemporary artists. Sometimes artists can focus a beam of light on a particular urban issue that allows us to see it in a completely different way, and contemporary art can also make the museum space so much more visually rich. The Museum of London has been working with contemporary artists to create installations for the museum, and so have the city museums in Luxembourg and Rotterdam, I believe, yes. I'm also a big fan of this project at the Chicago History Museum. The museum commissioned authors to write fictional stories for children about objects in the collection. The museum's educators then designed classroom lessons around the stories, and it's proved to be quite popular with local schools. But I would like to take this concept further and suggest that city museums could collaborate with many different kinds of local experts to understand the city, not just artists and writers or architects and urban planners, but also chefs, economists, garbage workers, scientists, statisticians. I think it would be great if city museums offered fellowships or residencies for these collaborators to spend time working with the museum staff for a month, a year, 6 months on joint projects. So I'm calling for a shift in process, not to occasionally partner with other disciplines for a one-off project, but to make it an integral part of our work moving forward. I'm going to end now with one last suggestion, and it's the one that means the most to me, actually, because it cuts across everything I've raised today and everything that city museums do. I think that city museums need to be more creative on every level. One of the things I've learned from all my travels over the past 2 years is that most city museums look and feel very similar. Most of us are displaying the same kinds of objects in the same standard ways and mounting the same kinds of exhibitions. I think our city residents deserve something more creative and imaginative that will keep them coming back again and again. We need to look for creativity when we hire and make it a priority in our daily work. There are many different kinds of creativity. You can be creative with your space, making it feel different and special instead of like every other museum your visitors have seen before. You can be creative with your objects, juxtaposing things that at first glance make no sense sitting side by side. You can be creative with the special skills of your staff, allowing someone to develop a project only she has the vision for. You can be creative with technology, combining information in order to see the city in a new light. Or you can be creative with programming, bringing people together for a new kind of experience. But let's all give some thought to how we can create city museums that really stand apart from each other, to not just take the projects I've shown you today and copy them, but to do something special and unique for your city. Cities are amazing living places. They deserve amazing living museums. So I'll close on that note, and are there any questions or comments for me?